This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by Corporate Board Member and host NYSE Euronext, along with Governance Knowledge Partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter with Corporate Board Member, and once again it's my pleasure to welcome you to part 2 of our remote show that's being held at the National Investor Relations Institute annual conference here in Orlando. And last week we had the opportunity of interviewing Jeff Morgan, NIRI's president and CEO. And this week we have the opportunity to go hear from the horse's mouth. Please welcome my guest, Sally Curley, who's the Senior Vice President of Investor Relations for Cardinal Health. Welcome, Sally. She also serves as the co-chair, which I'm sure has created a lot of duties for you this week.
Just a few.
We want to talk a little bit again about the board relation part. So first of all, tell me, after having X number of days here at the conference, sort of what is the feeling among investor relation officers between their function and their relationship with the board of directors?
We've talked about, actually, in the past, for investor relations officers, they've struggled with this concept of, for lack of a better phrase, getting a seat at the table. And I think one of the themes of this year, because this conference is really leadership in a changing world, and we've tried to bring different perspectives to that theme. And so we're trying to educate investor relations officers that it's really a state of mind. There's a clear value for a board member and for the C-suite for investor relations. I mean, they're the eyes of the ears in Wall Street, and they're not only a great sounding board for initiatives that the board and the C-suite might be thinking of in the context of how would our shareholders react, but they can also bring valuable insights from the street back to the boardroom. So I think there's a growing emphasis and a growing role for an interaction with investor relations officers, the C-suite, and board of directors because of just the voice of the shareholder, but also in the world of corporate governance as well.
What do you see as the biggest challenge as we see regulations make it easier for the shareholders to have access to push agendas and all the things that shareholder proposals? Talk a little bit, if you would, about what you think the challenge is for boards and for investor relations officers who, as we describe it, is really ends up being the voice for directors in many cases.
I think the biggest challenge right now is with the regulations that are pending, with just the regulation change and regulations that have occurred over the last 5 years even, is actually not only sorting through how to react to those regulations, and I'm specifically referencing most recently Dodd-Frank, but also knowing who your shareholders are. And it's this issue of shareholder transparency, and it's becoming more and more difficult to actually identify who your shareholders are. And so that creates a challenge for investor relations officers, that creates a challenge for the board. There's so many different constituencies out there. We talk about, one of the things we've talked about at the conference is this concept of ESG, which is environmental, social responsibility or sustainability initiatives, for example. And there are over 100 different groups that are rating these ESG initiatives right now. And so how do you sort through, as a board member, what are the most important areas of identification to shareholders? And then how do you sort through what you should focus your enterprise on, focus your board, focus your C-suite on in terms of enterprise risk management? So I think the investor relations officer can help to cut through that noise. But that's been a bit of a buzz at the conference so far.
Yeah. I can remember the days when the IR and the board would only worry about the getting to know who the shareholders were right prior to the annual meeting. I have to believe that those days are gone, that the IR spends a good part of the year making sure that they know, the shareholders, what the feelings are. Can you talk a little bit about how they might do that, which is different than the past?
Yeah, I think more and more, and again, this goes back to this growing role of investor relations and governance, but more and more, it's not enough to just understand who your shareholders are and what motivates them, but also who's voting your shares. And so there is a disconnect in certain instances between actually who you think is holding your shares, the portfolio manager that you might sit down across the table from, and who's actually pushing the trigger on a proxy vote. And so, I can give you an example. At Cardinal Health, one of the things that we've done to cultivate this over the last couple of years is worked very closely investor relations and our in-house securities counsel to purposefully go out to our proxy compliance contacts at our top 25 shareholders, and really we try to get to our top 50 off cycle. So we're in a June fiscal year. We will try to have these conversations with them in the February and March timeframe ahead of a November shareholder meeting. And the reason that we do that is because we can have an open dialogue, we can have a very non-issue focused, non-confrontational dialogue, and just get their opinions as thought leaders and find out what's on your mind, what trends are you seeing. And for example, if boards haven't heard of this trend, I mean, political contributions and disclosure of political contributions by companies is a trend that we heard about almost 6 months ago, before it really hit some of the mainstream press. So I think those conversations are extremely helpful, and again, the role of the investor relations officer working with the appropriate other individuals within an organization can really bring those to light for a board.
Yeah. As you've been sitting in your peer sessions and your roundtables, do you get the sense that we've seen recently where some boards have had surprise withhold votes, and now with majority voting and with proxy 452, which takes away all the discretionary votes that the brokerage company used to use in favor of management, we're seeing where a proxy advisory firm, by using those tools and the withhold vote thing, can put pressure on that. Is there a sense as you go through this that boards are much more mindful of that, and subsequently that has changed the IR position as well?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, a board member has to be more mindful of it in this day and age. And again, I think that's where transparency of the shareholder base and having those conversations with the right officials on the institutional side, your top 25, 50 shareholders, knowing not only who those individuals are, but how they're going to vote. Many of those institutions actually post their compliance regulations online. So, if there's good collaboration between the investor relations group, your internal securities counsel, a proxy advisory firm, if you can get their input, which is available but challenging in some instances, those data points coming together can be a pretty powerful source of information for a board and can help a board make a decision, even if the decision is that they aren't going to make a decision, that they're going to stick with their knitting. So.
As you've done your travels here at the conference, and knowing that a majority of our audience watching this show are board members, what topic do you think has been interesting that would be good for us to push out to the people watching this show that might be helpful for them?
As I think through yesterday's session, which started out with Adam Bryant, who's an award-winning New York Times publisher, he really touched on some key leadership principles, and one of the things that he touched on, one of the things that my CEO who spoke this morning, George Barrett, Chairman and CEO of Cardinal Health, touched on is really, and I think it's applicable for boards, is really trying to, George calls it reading between the lines of music. Adam called it being able to read the periphery. And I think as boards, C-suites, investor relations officers, really anybody in business, as you're engaging both internally but as you're engaging externally as well read the body language, read the periphery, read what's happening in the room, read who is reacting to someone that's speaking. And sometimes that really tells you volumes and can give you a particular insight into a shareholder. They may be saying one thing, they may be actually conveying another into an interaction with your C-suite. I mean, I think those were valuable insights that they brought. There's one piece of new data from yesterday's. We had a second panel, and Ann Gallo, who's the Senior Vice President at Wellington Financial and the Vice Chair of their Governance Committee, actually mentioned a new set of rules, which I hadn't frankly heard of, but will now look up. It's the UNPRI, which is the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing. And she said if you haven't heard of them, if you're not familiar with them, to make sure that you become familiar with them, because we will be hearing about them more and more. So.
I know you have for many years sort of held a senior position within this organization. I'm sure that that's due to your experience in not only your job but with this organization as well. I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Jeff last week, and that is, we've seen this pendulum swing, giving shareholders more and more access to the boardroom. And with that, there's certainly some positives to that as it stands for what's valuable to the investor, but it also has created a lot of challenges. Do you think that pendulum is too far when we see some of the resulting impact, like we saw the other day, a company being sued because their say on pay got voted down? That seems to be sort of an over-the-top kind of issue. So where do you feel that the pendulum is, and which way do you hope it's moving at this point?
Yeah, I feel that it maybe hasn't swung too far, but it might have the propensity to swing too far. Again, Ann Gallo, who spoke yesterday from Wellington at our conference, was asked a very similar question, and she actually said that she felt that some investors may be asking for too much. The board is put in place to help manage a company, to help raise the tough questions, as my CEO said, when things are going right, not just when things are going wrong, and to be the guidepost. But ultimately, the board does report to the shareholders. And so I think there needs to be a happy medium between trying to micromanage a company and a company's culture when a particular shareholder might not have intimate knowledge of that company's culture and what's right for that company, and having a say and having a true say with the board and being able to convey their opinion. So I'm not sure. I hope it will fall somewhere in the middle. Right now it's feeling like it's swinging a little bit too far.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. Well, Sally, thank you for giving us the inside look, not only from the conference perspective, but also from the investor relations officer's perspective of the relationship with the board. And thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, TK.
That will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope that you enjoyed our two-part series done remotely from the NIRI National Conference. We'll look forward to bringing you more shows as we have the opportunity to create content that will help you be a better director and committee member. And we'll see you next week.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by corporate board member and host NYSE Euronext, along with governance knowledge partner Paul Weiss and contributing partners National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.